SECfans.com. Week 2, we're going to talk a little bit about the state of the union in the SEC as it stands in Week 2. We're also going to get to a couple of reviews, or I guess previews, for some games coming up this week that are kind of interesting. We don't have a great slate. I said last week that there was a lot of crap games in the SEC. This week it's even worse. Auburn and Georgia are holding it down for the league. Everybody else is not taking a week off, but they're taking a week off. So first, before we get into a couple of games that we want to talk about, Husky, let's talk about a little bit kind of where we are coming out of week 1, what we saw that was important, what took us by surprise, and all that, but with a little spin on it in terms of how does this set us up for the rest of the season, or at least for the immediate season in terms of kind of what we're looking at. So what I'd like for you to do first is talk about kind of a high level what you saw this weekend, and does it sort of fit in line with where you thought the SEC would be and where these teams would be in these matchups after week 1, or were there some surprises?
For the most part, the SEC was basically what we expected it to be. I think obviously quarterback play and quarterback injuries sort of dominated the stat lines for a lot of teams around the conference. And not just within the teams themselves, but you had the situation at Georgia where Fromm came in. The Alabama game knocked out Francois for the rest of the season. I mean, those things are going to be quite possibly season defining items. But beyond that, you hate to say things are what we thought they were, but things pretty much are what we thought they were, I guess. Of particular note, we've kind of thought that Florida shoulda, woulda, coulda had a chance against Michigan, but neither one of us really wanted to go too far into that because of all the injuries, so we just kind of put it aside. We were both very high on Bentley for South Carolina. I think he's kind of showed what we thought and that he has a lot of potential, but he's not very consistent. Georgia, it's hard. Everybody's going to take a lot from that performance from Eason and Fromm and say, well, clearly they needed to make the change. I cautioned a little bit there. Fromm was 1 of 3. He only threw, Eason had only thrown 3 passes, and they hadn't done a lot offensively, and I think everybody kind of gets a particular idea. Eason had been high. I know he missed a couple, but that's just sort of nerves early, and Fromm was a little more cool and collected. But Fromm also came in and threw several very inadvisable passes. And then you travel around the conference a little bit. Stidham was, again, I think, kind of what we advertised. And I know we took a lot of heat about Stidham and, comments I made that saying that he was kind of comparable to Bo Wallace.
No Nick Marshall.
Yeah, well, he showed his wheels. But, I think, again, when I say he's like Bo Wallace, I think people forget that Bo Wallace, scored a rushing touchdown against Alabama in 2014 when they beat them, and was always a pretty good weapon with his legs. He's just not quite the, Nick Marshall is an NFL DB. That's kind of a little bit of a different level. Most teams didn't play anybody of note, and everybody pretty well took care of business for the most part. So, I think, maybe if you want to focus on one particular aspect that's going to be interesting to watch for the rest of the season, I think it's going to be that a lot of the offenses seem to have improved and a lot of the defenses seem to have regressed. Georgia in that game with App State handled things well, took them a little while to get going. But in the rest of the East, everybody was kind of lopsided one way or the other. Florida's offense was completely inept.
So Florida is an interesting one, and maybe we can start there because it was an early game. We got to digest that one almost in isolation. Florida, we talked about going into this that they had some issues in terms of personnel that they lost. You felt pretty good about them. I think you had them picked to win the East, and I had Georgia picked to win the East, and I don't know where we're left with both of these teams after we saw what Florida did against Michigan, and we see, like you said, Georgia might be without their quarterback for a really long time. So based on what you saw with Florida, let's do Florida first. Is it too early to panic, or do they need to be panicking a little bit in Gainesville?
I don't know about panic, but I'd definitely be concerned. We'd said in our preview that we thought if Felipe Franks and one of the young guys took the starting role, that was probably going to be a good sign because that meant that whatever they had, it was better than Del Rio, and we kind of knew what they had in Del Rio, and we knew that really wasn't good enough. Um, I think something you said that ended up being pretty prescient was Malik Zaire did not have very good statistics at Notre Dame in most of his starts, except for that one win over LSU. And I know you had a lot of skepticism that Zaire was going to be the answer.
Yeah, and I took some heat on that, like you did with a couple of your other quarterback projections. And I think a lot of it came from the fact that SEC fans were familiar with him mostly from the one game against LSU. And they remember that in that game, a lot of points were scored. And they remember Malik Zaire, and then he kind of disappeared from our minds, and now he's coming back. And we, like you said, these transfer quarterbacks, we remember the good ones, we forget the mediocre ones. But even looking at that LSU game, I pointed out the guy had 90, I think it was 96 yards passing and 96 yards rushing on a rainy day there in January. So we didn't have much to go on. And that's kind of what we keep coming back to that frustrates us, given that we're numbers driven, that all this is speculation. We didn't have a lot to go on with Stidham. We had a few games. But yeah, Malik Zaire, I wasn't down on the kid. I just didn't, I was like, we can't christen him the next great thing at Florida because we don't know anything about him. All we know is he's had, I think, fewer than 100 career attempts, runs a lot, and the word out of camp wasn't great. But if he's getting beat by a guy that we saw this Saturday that looked kind of lost, what does that tell you about the quarterback situation in Florida?
Well, I mean, to some degree, it may just tell you that Michigan is a very good defense, and I think there's some merit to that. Um, but you know, I don't think it was the injury issue. Callaway, this has been said a lot by a lot of people, right? Scarlett and Callaway are key cogs, but this went kind of beyond that. Um, I don't personally think Franks is such a bad option. I know he didn't generate a ton for the offense, but one of the interesting things to me is they put Zaire in kind of late in the game when Franks was already struggling. But Zaire ended up throwing twice as many passes as Franks. He threw 17 to Franks' 9. He had a lower completion percentage than Franks did. He had a significantly lower yards per attempt average. He only averaged about 6 yards per attempt. And the QB rating for Zaire was 4.6. And Franks, or QBR, I should say, ESPN's metric. And then Franks was 23, which was only a little bit lower than any the Michigan passers in that ball game. So I don't completely panic about the quarterback situation. I don't think Zaire is the answer. Personally, I think the coaching staff panicked in that game by putting in Zaire, and I don't know that they were ever going to win that game, but I think they were less likely to win it even more when Zaire came than when they before. And that obviously the strip sack, fumble touchdown, put that game into a nastier looking score than it really was. The real concern with this game, and I'm sure most Florida fans realize it, was the rushing game. Michigan won this game because they outgained Florida on the ground 215 yards to 11. Through the air, it was only a 30-yard differential. Both team, Michigan was 12 of 26. Florida was 14 of 26, 218 passing to 181 passing. Everybody's focused on the quarterbacks, but the quarterbacks in this game were actually pretty darn even. The only difference is Michigan threw 2 pick sixes. What was really lopsided was the fact that Michigan could run the ball with some level of consistency, still only about 4 yards a carry. But man, Florida, they averaged a half yard a carry in this ball game. And I think the concern at this point really isn't the quarterback, it's the offensive line. And I know Scarlett, losing him, I think, is significant in that area because he is their best back. Much like Isaac was far more effective than Evans for Michigan. But if you only get 11 yards rushing in a ball game, and let's take out sack yardage, and I think that bumps it up to about 40 yards rushing in the ball game. And your best back as averaging 2.6 yards per carry. You've got serious issues on the offensive line that you're going to have to sort out.
Yeah, but my concern here is, like you said, one or two players, even regardless of how important they are, I feel like we're coming into a broken record situation with Florida where, okay, they have had some issues at quarterback. They've also always been able to run a little bit, but when you could shut that run game down, and it happened late in the season last year, they hit a brick wall. And I felt at times in this game, we saw a little bit, and I'm going to give you an opportunity for a mini rant here. We saw a little bit of that old Nussmeier coaching style come back into play where he wasn't really putting his quarterback or his running backs in a situation for success, in my opinion, relative to the looks they were getting from the defense. Are we getting to the point where it's too late that we've got a head coach in Florida, in Mac, who's just not been able to break ties with Nussmeier when he should have? He's maybe a year too late on this, and he's not going to be able to save himself if this ship, runs aground. Or is it something where if their offense is really bad this year, he can put it on Nussmeier and maybe save himself another season?
I don't know. I think patience is running a little thin in Florida. I mean, they're not going to fire the guy if he wins the division. You just don't fire someone that makes the SEC championship game. But every year it seems a little bit closer to the fact that, if as long as if he doesn't make it, he's out, and he's just got to save himself by making it. So, for those that don't know, we're obviously not huge fans of Nussmeier here. Doug Nussmeier's storied career is kind of interesting because he coached around McElwain years ago. The connections dating back to the Fresno State days, but when he came to Alabama, he'd had a somewhat successful career at Washington, and proved them. It's a little unclear too there how much was that really him, and then how much of that was that period they were in. I think it was the Sarkisian transition. He comes to be the coordinator at Alabama in 2012 to 13. Famously in 2012, it was the last couple games of the season that Alabama realized Eddie Lacy was unstoppable, and in that Georgia game and the SEC championship, it took them about half the game to realize that if they just ran Eddie Lacy every play, Georgia absolutely could not stop them. And then 13, was the great disappointing season with a kick six, and really had some kind of amazingly lackluster performances in a couple big games there, and ended up getting blown out by Oklahoma. Um, and even after the 2012 year, there was a feeling that maybe he wasn't beloved. And I've heard the statement that apparently in the booth during that game at one point he made a weird call against Georgia, and he said to one of the other coaches in the booth, "Well, I guess I'm getting fired now," or something to that effect. And so,
He was right.
from Alabama, yeah, yeah, and he made it one more year. Kind of got encouraged to move on, and he went to the lame duck staff at Michigan, and lasted 1 year at Michigan before Brady Hoke got fired. And since then, he's been, for the past 3 seasons now at Florida. Um, I think Nussmeier's a good guy from everything I've heard. I think he's probably a pretty sharp guy. I've heard there's some issues with his personality meshing with coaches, though people seem to like him. But I think sometimes Nussmeier with big games, his play calling reminds me of somebody that's just kind of getting overwhelmed playing like NCAA football or Madden or what have you, and they start trying to, they're calling crossing routes every play, and they're calling the little throw to the tight end where he bubbles out, and the thing they feel like they can reliably complete. And he kind of gets in a weird rut when he's struggling. And when you say creativity, a lot of times creativity is just variety. It's figuring out different ways to use the offense, using a lot of different types of plays, and just finding some way to strain the other team. And I don't know what it is about Nussmeier's play calling in particular. I think part of it is that there's a lack of a real power run game. And then it's very much short yardage finesse offense with a small vertical component. But, the we had a rant on this last year, but what it basically comes down to is Nussmeier helped get Brady Hoke fired, and then on the other side of the ball, Auburn's defensive coordinator from 2012 got Chiswick fired, and then moved on and got another coach fired at Virginia Tech. So it's kind of weird to me that Nussmeier's been at Florida as long as he has, but yeah, I'm totally with you. At the end of the day, I think McElwain may just need to cut bait here, and I don't see a light at the end of this tunnel.
So I don't want to bury Florida yet. It's one game. I don't think we can get too high or too low on any program after 1 week. But give me 30 seconds on Florida, how they can turn their season around after having a pretty disappointing opener.
Okay, well, Florida did return 4 to 5 guys on the line, depending on alignment that had started. You get Callaway back, you get Scarlett back. The biggest thing is going to be just get a run game going with Scarlett. Let Franks get comfortable and aggressive enough to actually try to attempt throws downfield. And then just rely on that defense because the defense is darn good. And I think the truth is Florida is going to be in every game they play. And they may drop one they really shouldn't, but there's nobody in the East, Georgia, South Carolina, Tennessee, that they're not going to be, an absolute challenge for the other team to score. So just stay in games, keep things close, and pull out the close ones.
So one of those teams that you talked about just now is South Carolina, a team that managed 35 points this weekend with 246 total yards against an NC State team that a lot of people were slating as a dark horse for making a run in the ACC championship or towards the ACC championship. And a lot of it had to do with their defensive line and their returning defense. So we're not super surprised that South Carolina didn't put up a whole lot of yardage, but are we surprised that they came away with a win in a game that you and I think, had them? We were hoping for a respectable showing. We weren't expecting a win here. What's your takeaway from this game, and how does South Carolina build on this going into the season?
My biggest takeaway from this is Bentley has the potential to make every throw on the field, and that gives them a consistent threat on offense that they just haven't had in recent years. Um, Defensively, I actually still have some concerns. I thought their corners still have trouble at times, but they're a lot more sound than they were. Finley threw 64 passes. That game went, it was just kind of ridiculously long and lopsided and, honestly bizarre in the way the yardage total worked out. I don't take a ton from this game because, the yardage belies the score, right? Let's put it in perspective. The South Carolina wins this game 35-28, but Bentley 17 of 29. Now, 4 of those passes went for 100 yards, and the other 14 passes total went for 115 yards. And I know that kind of happens with every quarterback, but the point being, they had a handful of big chunk plays that got them points. They only had 31 yards rushing total. Dowdle was the best rusher, 12 of 27. On the other side of the ball, North Carolina State had 415 yards passing. They rushed 35 times for 89 yards. Every conceivable metric, for the most part, North Carolina State led this game. They had a little bit lower yards per pass, but they were far more consistent. They attempted way more passes. They had a much yards per rush. Again, South Carolina only had 1.5 yards per carry. So, I'm not going to call this win a fluke, and I don't want South Carolina fans to dislike me, but I think they're all, I think for the most part, South Carolina fans are realistic at this point. But the reality is South Carolina has to be careful taking too much from this game because they gave up over 500 yards of offense, and they're very lucky to have only given up 28 points. Darn near gave up a touchdown at the end of that game. That thing maybe goes to overtime, and North Carolina State wins. I think the reality of this game is, they were +1 in the turnover margin. They got big chunk plays when they needed to. Chunk plays tend to generate points more than other plays, but they were outgained more than 2-1. The other team had a better third down completion or efficiency. And statistically, when you talk long term, I'm more interested in yardage and third down conversions and things like that than I am the score, frankly, because I think that's a better indicator of how the team's going to perform. And what I saw from South Carolina was a tremendous amount of potential, but I don't see the consistency you need to win the division. So I think they're going to be better than the years past, but I still think it's a lot to ask South Carolina to win the division because there's just, across, especially defensively, there's just a number of positions like cornerback where they aren't quite as talented as some of their opponents.
So it's we're not going to do a preview on this game, but NC State win, and then they travel to Missouri this weekend, and I think Vegas kind of agrees with you in that South Carolina's improved, but hold on, let's pump the brakes a little bit because they've got Missouri as a 3-point favorite in this game, in spite of the fact that Missouri gave up 1.2 million points in the first half to SEMO. So let's talk about how this sets them up in this game. Do you feel like South Carolina should be the favorite? And if they can win, is this how big a deal is that in terms of changing your perception of them being a player in the East?
I actually think the South Carolina Missouri game is going to be a pretty pivotal game in the East because I think the winner of that game has a decent shot of being third in the conference. Not to downplay Tennessee, who can still show up, but as we're recording this in the background, I'm watching Tennessee currently losing to Georgia Tech. That may change by the time this recording's over. But Missouri, they were giving up yards like a 2000.com bubble company gave up stock, right? I mean, they just left and right to Missouri State. It was crazy, but I also saw a Missouri team that could score every time they touched the football. And in the SEC East, with all the inconsistency that every offense has, and that's what I was talking about, South Carolina especially, in a given drive, they could beat anybody and score on anybody, but they also can stall themselves. Bentley can make every throw, but he's pretty inconsistent. And with Missouri, you're going to have to keep pace. And I don't know that I've seen any team in the SEC East that has convinced me that if they're in a barn burner, that they can actually keep pace and not stop themselves. And so, if Missouri could beat South Carolina, they're going to have an inside edge to try to push the rest of the conference and stay in that conference race. And if South Carolina can beat Missouri and kind of put that dog behind them, now they're the ones that are going to be closing in on Florida and Georgia. So it's going to be really, to me, it's a question of how much can South Carolina maintain consistency. As much as Missouri's defense is weak, and I think it is just straight up weak. Missouri's defense did not get run over in the second half. It took them a long time to adjust. They closed down a little bit the second half of that game. But everybody that plays them, it's going to be more about, can you execute your game plan, play in and play out, because you're going to have to be able to do that to keep pace with the amount of points Missouri is going to put on the board.
All right, so you just staying in the East real quick for a minute. You touched on Tennessee, the fact that they're losing. I think it's 21-7. Last time I looked, 21-14. We both worried a little bit about Tennessee, mainly in our preview show. We worried about them defensively, but you also had some points about the offensive production that they lost. Dormity's having a little bit of a struggle in this game, which is to be expected. It's his first start. But how much do we think that the lack of wide receiver, comfort blanket from last year with the guys that have that experience, the lack of having those guys is contributing to this 14 points in almost 3 full quarters of football? And are any alarm bells ringing for you for Tennessee in their season right now?
I again, I think it's expected. We had the whole discussion in the preview of where I thought teams were and what I thought was important. My overriding concern for most everybody was returning wide receiver production. Watching this game, I think Dormity's been solid. He's made most of his throws from an accuracy perspective. The thing that he's really struggling with, frankly, is just having an open guy that's an easy read. He's throwing into traffic a lot, and he's throwing into traffic because his guys aren't particularly open. We talked about this a lot, that a lot said of Juwan Jennings, but the depth issue is particularly bad. And Jennings went out of this game injured. What that meant is, you lost your number one guy, and you replaced him from your number four. And in this case, your number four guy was, I don't know, your number 7 or number 8 guy from a year prior. Callaway just made a good catch here, and that's where we're at in this ball game, so you know exactly when we're recording. But at the same time, I think Dormity's pretty much doing what's asked of him. He looks like a guy that hasn't played a whole lot. He's not always making the right read. But I kind of tip my hat to him a little bit because I think he does look serviceable. He's trying to make an effort. You'd like to see him have over 100 yards passing with 26 attempts, but I don't think he's going to lose them the ball game. I think it's just more concerning that they don't have more push in the run game. And again, I think it's really concerning that they don't their receivers are struggling to get separation from a Georgia Tech secondary that is not particularly good. And so I don't know. I mean, it's like every other team in the East. It's inconsistent. I think they've played well given all the injuries and giving all the lack of returning production. I certainly think they'll get better. But I mean, it is kind of pretty much what we expected.
There's the other thing at play that kind of happened a little bit last year where Tennessee, yeah, they got that win against Virginia Tech in an ugly, I think Virginia Tech fumbled it 5 times game. But they also struggled with, gosh, I think it was like Ohio or somebody like that, and then had a couple other ugly ones. But they managed to get some momentum mid-season. Could you see that being at play here, given that they're breaking in a new quarterback and so many new faces that they've got the talent, it just needs a little time to mature with some actual on-the-field experience? Or is this one of those where it's going to be a whole rebuilding year playing for next year?
I think it's a little too early to say. I don't know that it's a total rebuilding year. And I think there's talent here. Watching the Georgia Tech game, honestly, it's hard because it's the end of the third quarter here, and Tennessee's only run 38 plays. And I mean that's insane, right? The fact that I think their Georgia Tech's run about 65. Basically, they can't get off the field. It's not surprising because they've had not only did they have turnover at linebacker and they're Barnett, Reeves Maben, but then Kirkland goes out with an injury. And they're just having a hard time consistently tackling Georgia Tech and slowing down that triple option from just marching its way down the field. And because of that, we really, honestly haven't seen a whole lot from Tennessee. I've only seen about 39 plays at this point, almost to the end of the game. And that's kind of crazy to say when we watch Texas A&M implode after, I don't know, 95 plays.